Hey, I'm Charlie. Welcome to Millstone Research. In this video, I'll be explaining why raising a child as one of Jehovah's Witnesses is child abuse. There's a lot to cover here, but I'm going to begin by reading you something from a UK Department of Education document called Keeping Children Safe in Education, linked below. This is the definition of emotional abuse found in that guideline. Emotional abuse is the persistent emotional maltreatment of a child, such as to cause severe and adverse effects on the child's emotional development. It may involve conveying to the child that they are worthless or unloved, inadequate, or valued only insofar as they meet the needs of another person. It may include not giving the child opportunities to express their views, deliberately silencing them, or making fun of what they say or how they communicate. It may feature age or developmentally inappropriate expectations being imposed on children. These may include interactions that are beyond a child's developmental capacity, as well as overprotection and limitation of exploration and learning, or preventing the child from participating in normal social interaction. It may involve seeing or hearing the ill treatment of another. It may involve serious bullying, including cyberbullying, like JW Broadcasting, causing children frequently to feel frightened or in danger, or the exploitation or corruption of children. Some level of emotional abuse is involved in all types of mistreatment as a child, though it may occur alone. I'm not going to bother unpacking all of that, because any current or former witnesses watching who are being honest know full well that that is a perfect description of being raised as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. The question is, why is that the case? Why is emotional abuse that teachers in the UK are required to report to authorities identical to how millions of Jehovah's Witness children are being treated everywhere on earth at this very moment? That's what we'll be discussing in this video. And to do that, we'll first explore what healthy parenting looks like before moving on to what we and our parents likely experienced. As we go through this material, I'm going to be building a kind of template on the board that will help to simplify and organize some important concepts. You'll likely discover that you're already very familiar with the topics in this video. You just might not have had the names for things, or you might not have realized how intimately these subjects impact each of us every day. So most adults spend very little time imagining what life is like for an infant. For some of us, that's because our childhoods are not very pleasant to think about. But we need to spend some time here because early childhood is where we form many of the beliefs and behaviors that we rely on for the rest of our lives. So let's travel back to the day before you were born. You've spent the last several months gradually becoming more aware of your prenatal environment, and you do not have any idea that a postnatal environment even exists. Your embryonic environment is warm, safe, and nurturing. You've never felt cold, hunger, or fear. There's no lack, and although you can hear the sound of your mother's heartbeat, digestive system, and voice, these sensations are not associated with any other yet. At this point, there's no meaningful difference between the experience that you're having, your environment, and you. And then, calamity, disaster. Departing from your mother's body, you find yourself somewhere very cold, very loud, very bright, and very large. In complete contrast to the security of the womb, this is a place of impossible confusion and fright. But not just that, because soon enough there is a return of warmth and food and comfort, and though you don't have any words for these things yet, you get the impression that this unexpected turn of events might turn out okay.
Children are not born with the godly quality of love. In fact, because of imperfection, they're born with the opposite. Often a tendency to be selfish. They grab things, mine, mine, mine. So that's the attitude that they are born with, if you think about it.
You're having a very real experience, but it's a kaleidoscope of physical sensations, feelings, and impressions. There isn't really a you there yet to make sense of the experience. So for now, you consist of your awareness of your environment through physical sensations like temperature, hunger, sounds, damp diapers, your hapless and hopeful reactions to those sensations, and the outcomes of those reactions, like being fed, comforted, or having your diaper changed. Let's say that looks like this. A heart, mind, and body with an awareness, a core self at the center. This is our starting point for every childhood, whether we had good enough parents or not.
So obviously, wise Christian parents make good use of that little window of time. They have to put these spiritual values in their little minds, in their little hearts.
The pediatrician and psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott define good enough parenting simply as the sound instincts of normal parents leading to stable and healthy families. Of course, no parents or families are perfect, nor do they need to be. They do, however, need to provide some essential environmental and experiential elements to ensure the healthy development of the child. A safe, secure base to grow in the form of stable home and healthy relationships, community, and belonging. Healthy and consistent nourishment in the form of food, attention, play, love, and learning. And healthy and consistent structure in the form of emotional, mental, and physical boundaries and protection of the child's heart, mind, and body. A healthy childhood home, then, functions very much like a replacement womb, meant to allow the child to develop enough to eventually leave the home and make their way into the world as a healthy and independent adult. Now that we've identified the essential care needed for good enough parenting, let's move on to the caregivers themselves. Good enough parents are capable of providing for the emotional, mental, and physical needs of their children, not just occasionally, but consistently. The child needs to believe that they will have love, safety, food, and a home, not just today, but into the future as well. Good enough parents recognize their own limitations and have largely resolved any trauma they've been exposed to during their own childhoods. They are loving and healthy people, engaged in loving and healthy relationships with each other. Good enough parents place the needs of the child above their own fears, expectations, and disappointments. Good enough parents know that they don't know who this child, this fledgling person, will be, but good enough parents are committed to honoring and protecting the human life they've created by providing for the child and equipping it as best they can for its eventual independence from them. Good enough parents hold a realistic but enthusiastic and curious view of life and instill that enthusiasm and curiosity to their offspring.
Their curiosity often gets them into trouble.
Good enough parents see the child as a very unique, beautiful, and valuable expression of life itself. But for any of this to happen, the reality of the child and the experience they're having must be seen. Now, from the perspective of a child, our parents are gods. They're not like gods, they are gods. Long before we understand anything about the world around us, our interactions with our parents define our earliest concepts of authority and subjection. Parents are, initially, giants who control and are responsible for every aspect of our existence. So they're sources of great fear as well as great comfort, and ultimately, they are the inscrutable entities who are responsible for our survival. Good enough or not, parents are initially the highest authorities and lords of our young lives. This is a really, really important point. The word lord comes from the Germanic loford, meaning loafward or bread keeper, aka the person who feeds you, aka the person who decides whether you live or die. That definition applies equally well to a parent, king, or God, our Father in heaven, the Lord Almighty. An infant's earliest concepts about survival, protection, belonging, and authority all begin with their relationship with their parents or primary caregivers.
The point is, you can't start too early, but you can certainly start too late. That makes me think of the saying, as the twig is bent, so the tree grows.
In fact, every interaction we have with our parents and environment informs and shapes our earliest beliefs about the nature of reality. Is it loving, hostile, or indifferent? D.W. Winnicott, mentioned earlier, argued that a key function of good enough parenting is to ensure a supportive environment for the growing child's quite disturbing and inevitable realization that they are not all-powerful, without destroying their appetite for life and their ability to form a realistic perception of themselves and the world.
So we have to teach them humility, humbly viewing others as superior to themselves. See,
over the course of a healthy childhood, the parents and child must collaborate to discover who that child is. The child is encouraged to explore interests, ask questions, and play, because play is a form of education, and if you're doing it right, education feels like play.
children love to play. So the negative trait of young children is that they prefer play over responsibility. Think about it.
The child then grows in confidence and willingness to challenge themselves. Failure is not treated as a bad thing, certainly not as bad as not trying at all. Being bad at something does not make the child bad. Failure does not make the child a failure. Failure only means that they're trying and learning new things. These experiences shape and define the child's persona, the person they present themselves to be to the world. This is the persona. Persona means mask, literally the mask worn by actors in ancient Greek theaters. In healthy adults, the persona is mainly social necessity. We all behave slightly differently in different contexts, and that's fine as long as we never confuse that outward presentation or persona with who we actually are, our core selves. When a child is raised in an environment where honest expression of their thoughts and feelings is encouraged and safe to do, there is very little conflict between who they actually are and who they present themselves to be. There's no reason to hide or pretend to be anything else. While there is a very real and necessary dependence on good enough parents throughout childhood, the child's mind, body, and heart are always kept in the service of the reality of that child's experience and agency.
And they generally need a lot of time and attention. They're high maintenance.
This allows the child to become their own safe base, provide themselves with nourishment in the form of food, play, love, and learning, and provide themselves with healthy structure in the form of self-determined boundaries, protection, healthy habits, and relationships.
If we had time, we could have discussed other negative traits to be avoided.
Dependence gradually shifts towards independence, and the child will grow up to become a healthy adult and good enough parent themselves should they ever decide to have children. A child doesn't need to be raised by good enough parents to become one eventually, but it certainly helps. So that's good enough parenting. That's one side of the spectrum. Now let's look at how abusive and neglectful parenting compares to that. Do abusive and neglectful parents provide a safe, secure base? No. Do abusive and neglectful parents provide healthy and consistent structure? No. They offer either extremely constrained structure or none at all, as well as completely blurred emotional boundaries. Do abusive and neglectful parents provide healthy and consistent nourishment? No. The child's needs and wants come second to the needs and wants of the parent. In contrast to good enough parents who serve as protectors and providers to their children, abusive and neglectful parents become the enforcers or excusers of their own abuse and neglect. I'm now going to read a part of a recent lecture by Dr. Sam Backman, mainly because I can't put it any better than this. He says, abusive parents, parents who are selfish, who are absent, parents who are depressed, parents who parentify the child, parents who instrumentalize the child, parents who spoil the child and isolate him from reality, parents who do not allow the child to form boundaries, don't allow the child to separate, don't allow the child to individuate. These are abusive parents. And because they do this, the child comes to depend on them. And he depends on them for acting in the world. When he wants to go act in the world, he has to go through the intermediation of his abusive parents. He doesn't have the necessary healthy grandiosity to take on the world because his parents keep broadcasting to him, you are not an individual, you're an extension, you're an object. We're going to love you only if you perform predictably and expectedly. So the child doesn't separate from the parent, doesn't become an individual, an agent. He doesn't develop agency and self-efficacy. So the child comes to depend on the intermediation of his parents in order to act in the world. But even worse, the child comes to depend on the parents when it comes to regulating his internal environment. Many ego functions, many psychological needs and psychological functions are carried out via the parents in a child who grows up in an abusive environment. So the parents become, in a way, an extension of the child very much as the child becomes an extension of the parent. They intermesh. They engulf each other. They fuse and merge. They create, essentially, a codependent cell. This renders the child eternally helpless. The child learns that if he wants to assure the parental love, he needs to act helpless. The child outsources and allows the parent to perform functions that normally are internalized. In other words, all his psychology becomes the parent's psychology. His mind is a hive mind. His mind is intermeshed and intermingled and entangled with the parents' minds. Spot on. Also, end quote. Unlike with good enough parents, abusive and neglectful parents see the child not as a unique and separate person, but as a resource, a utility, an object that exists to stabilize the parent's own emotional dysregulation and to validate the parent's unrealistic perception of themselves. Alice Miller speaks to this in the opening chapter of her book, The Drama of the Gifted Child. The child has a primary need from the very beginning of her life to be regarded and respected as the person she really is at any given time. When we speak here of the person she really is at any given time, we mean emotions, sensations, and their expression from the first day onward. In an atmosphere of respect and tolerance for her feelings, the child, in the phase of separation, will be able to give up symbiosis with the mother and accomplish the steps towards individuation and autonomy. If they are to furnish these prerequisites for the healthy development of their child, the parents themselves ought to have grown up in such an atmosphere. If they did, they will be able to assure the child the protection and well-being she needs to develop trust. Parents who did not experience this climate as children are themselves deprived. Throughout their lives, they will continue to look for what their own parents could not give them at the appropriate time: the presence of a person who is completely aware of them and takes them seriously. This search, of course, can never fully succeed since it relates to a situation that belongs irrevocably to the past, namely to the time right after birth and during early childhood. A person with this unsatisfied and unconscious, because repressed need, will nevertheless be compelled to attempt its gratification through substitute means as long as she ignores her repressed life history. The most efficacious objects for substitute gratification are the parent's own children. The newborn baby or small child is completely dependent on his parents, and since their caring is essential for his existence, he does all he can to avoid losing them. From the first day onward, he will muster all his resources to this end, like a small plant that turns toward the sun to survive. In my work with people in the helping professions, I have often been confronted with a childhood history that seems significant to me. There was a mother, or primary caregiver, who at the core was emotionally insecure and who depended for her equilibrium on her child's behaving a particular way. This mother was able to hide her insecurity from her child and from everyone else behind a hard, authoritarian, even totalitarian facade. The child had an amazing ability to perceive and respond intuitively, that is, unconsciously, to the need of the mother, or of both parents, for him to take on the role that had been unconsciously assigned to him. This role secured love for the child, that is, his parents' exploitation. He could sense that he was needed, and this need guaranteed him a measure of existential security. End quote. Remember what I said about parents being gods? Well, from the perspective of a child, the highest authority and sole source of their comfort and survival cannot be bad. That doesn't compute. So these poor children cannot recognize that the abuse and neglect they're enduring is abnormal.
Children tend to be trusting, not prejudiced, and not hypocritical.
Having one's survival be entirely dependent on an emotionally immature, unstable, and at times hostile caregiver is psychologically unbearable to the child. So all of the goodness being withheld is projected back onto the abusive parent, while all of the badness, having nowhere to go, is self-applied in the form of untrue and horrifying beliefs about their own value, belonging, and lovability. This creates constant and unresolvable shame. If the Lord of your life is harming you, then it must be deserved. And so the innocent child concludes that they must not be innocent. They must actually be flawed, wicked, and sinful. They must actually deserve this living hell. They must be the problem, and the abusive parent is perfectly happy to reinforce and promote this tragic misunderstanding. This contributes to the child developing dichotomous or black and white thinking, meaning that the child begins to see themselves, others, and the world as a whole as either all good or all bad. Us versus them. Good versus bad. I'd like to take a moment to define the word abuse because I'll be using that word a lot in this and future videos. Abuse, or abuse, like abnormal, means the abnormal use of something. So from now on, whenever I say the word abuse, just remember abnormal use. Abusive parenting entails the abnormal use of a child, and this can take many forms. Narcissistic abuse might include parentalization, forcing the child to satisfy the emotional, mental, and physical demands of the parent. Instrumentalization, using them to accomplish some goal, like, say, succeeding in a field in which the parent had failed. Extreme indulgence and spoiling, which ignores the child's actual needs and wants and instead indebts them to the parent and ensures that they remain helpless, childlike dependence, so that they can never abandon the abusive parent. Or disinterest and neglect. All of these are forms of objectification. Another way to say that is that these are all forms of dehumanization. In all cases, the reality of the child's experience is never seen or even considered.
What gift can you present to Jehovah? Your children. When you do your best to bring your children up in the discipline and admonition of Jehovah, you are preparing a gift to your God.
Because the child is being treated as an object, they learn very quickly that their needs will not be met when expressed and may even lead to punishment, so they stop expressing them. Same with their thoughts, same with their emotions. This failure to be seen is a vicious form of abandonment and is incredibly destructive to the child's development, sense of self, and beliefs about the world. This results in emotional enmeshment and trauma bonding because the child's heart, mind, and body are all put into the service of the needs of the parent. So now they're all chained up. At the same time, the child becomes aware that there are ways of performing or behaving that increase their chances of safety, approval, and what they think is love, but actually is just conditional acceptance. This is the start of the narcissistic shared fantasy, the false image that everyone has to play along with in order to keep their emotionally dysregulated parent or parents happy.
There are thousands more brothers and sisters that have been raised in the truth by godly parents who are spearheading the work in the ministry, in Bethel service, on construction projects, and in relief work.
Remember how failure was treated by good enough parents? Well, in abusive families, failure has very real consequences, typically physical, mental, or emotional violence and neglect. What this means is that failure becomes associated with failing to survive, or be safe, or belong. In these childhoods, the child is bad when they're bad. They are a failure when they fail. Because that is so unbearable, the child will sometimes compensate for the image of themselves as wrong, bad, worthless, and unlovable by creating an imaginary version of themselves that is the opposite in every way to those things. Always capable, always right, and always good. This is a false self to which the child sacrifices their true self, the false idol that abusive parents have been worshiping and shaping from the start. That child can only feel safe or sufficient or deserving of love if they become exactly what the parent wants them to be. And that might be a doctor, a lawyer, an actor, a musician, or a baptized publisher, or a pioneer, or a Bethelite.
Some are governing body members, helpers, branch committee members, circuit overseers, elders, and ministerial servants. Where did so many of these come from? Hundreds of thousands were children of Christian parents.
Why? Because that will make the parent the one who raised a successful doctor, lawyer, actor, musician, baptized publisher, pioneer, or Bethelite. The child only exists to reinforce whatever it is that the parent most wants to believe about themselves. Reality be damned. This is an abnormal but extremely common use of children. The father whose son was always going to go to Bethel, the mother whose daughter was always going to be a pioneer. It's all the same phenomenon. And all of us were groomed to sacrifice our lives to the Watchtower's shared fantasy.
You parents, do your best to package the gift of your children so that they will be useful to Jehovah.
Because the child's experiences, thoughts, and feelings are consistently dismissed, inner and outer reality becomes an enemy. The need for love, combined with the constant threat of punishment and abandonment, create fear and pain that must either be ignored or numbed. The term narcissism actually comes from the Greek word narcos, meaning numb. Same root word as narcotics. So narcissism means being numb to oneself and mistaking the false image for reality. The persona is more important to the narcissistically abusive parent than who that child actually is. When the abuse is severe enough, the core self is so neglected, it withers and basically dies. This leaves behind a mind and body that is completely in service to the false self, the imaginary golden child or black sheep that the abusive parent has been interacting with and validating all along. Children treated this way become adults who essentially exist only as an idea, a rage-filled absence where the core self used to be. These people can only see the world to be a hostile and dangerous place, and they can only feel safe by making use of other people as objects or utilities, blocks of wood to be carved to satisfy their whims and insecurities through constant validation, acts of service, and absolute obedience. Constant validation, acts of service, and absolute obedience. Isn't that exactly what the Watchtower demands from its followers?
We thank you, parents, for all that you've done and the precious gifts you've offered up to Jehovah and his organization.
Imagine for a moment that you only existed when someone in the world was thinking about you. Imagine blinking in and out of existence and never knowing how long it would be before you disappeared again. That is the horror of the narcissist's life, and it's the reason that victims of this kind of abuse are constantly trying to be seen. The false self does not exist without someone there to say, "Oh yes, you are so smart, you are so talented, you are so perfect." But it can never be enough because there's no true self there to be satisfied. This is also why any attention is good attention. Fame and praise is preferred, but infamy will also work. Both are evidence of the narcissist's existence. This is a black hole shaped like a human being. There can be no growth to a fixed image. There can be no self-reflection because there isn't a self to reflect. There can be no self-control because there's no self to do any controlling. There can be no empathy because empathy requires putting oneself in another's place, and that's simply not possible for someone without a self. So instead, narcissists turn outward and attempt to control their environments by building families and communities and religions that exist entirely to serve their endless, capricious, and impossible demands. This is how you create psychopathic narcissists, or as I like to call them, governing body members. This is also exactly how Charles Taze Russell, the founder of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, was raised.
Some may say, unity of belief, you're brainwashed. Well, we do agree that our thinking has been washed clean from the complicated doctrines that have evolved since Jesus walked the earth. When a classroom full of students take a math course like algebra, at the end of the class, no one accuses them of being brainwashed when they all end up united in their understanding. They simply learn the math accurately and put it to use. Our very personality changes because of our new dominant mental attitude. The beautiful thing is that this process is at work in millions of Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide.
The Bible makes clear that all of God's people, every one of you here in this room, and every servant of God around this earth who support Jehovah's anointed ones, are in a war. Well, if we are in this spiritual war, what do we expect? With every war comes intense hatred. As Jesus foretold, people will become faint out of fear and expectation of the things coming upon the inhabited earth. To their horror, they will realize that they miscalculated when they attacked Jehovah's people. They will be forced to know the Creator in his role as military commander, Jehovah of armies. Jehovah will no doubt unleash heavenly armies and natural forces in such a way that he protects his loyal servants but eliminates his enemies. What a powerful description. You see, brothers, when we are afraid or we are terrified, we can then be controlled by our enemies. You see, people who are in fear of death are constantly afraid. And as a result, they can be manipulated and controlled.
What a fitting picture of the final end of all of God's enemies. Sobering, yet something we look forward to. However, the apostates and the enemies of Jehovah would say, well, that's gruesome, that's despicable. You teach your people these things? No, God teaches his people these things. This is what he's foretelling. And frankly, for friends of Jehovah God, how reassuring that they're finally going to be gone. All these despicable enemies that have just reproached Jehovah's name, destroyed, never, ever to live again. Now, it's not that we rejoice in someone's death, but when it comes to God's enemies, finally, particularly, they will vanish like smoke. So I thought this would be a nice memory aid to this verse stay in the mind. Here's what Jehovah's promising. As Jehovah's enemies.
False rumors are often spread during wartime. Brothers, this is war. We need to put up a hard fight for the faith, as if our life depended on it, because it does.
Those people could be manipulated, they could be controlled, they could even get them to do the most wicked things because they were afraid.
The time is short, yes. Yet our public ministry is no less important now just because the end is close. In fact, it's even more important that we continue caring for this ministry as the end approaches.
To appreciate the extent of Jehovah's and Jesus' trust in the faithful slave, reflect on what he has promised its members. He has promised them immortality and incorruption. Soon, just before Armageddon, the remaining members of the slave will be taken to heaven. Revelation 4:4 describes these resurrected, anointed as co-rulers with Christ. Revelation 22:5 says they will rule not only for 1,000 years, but forever and ever. what immense trust Jesus shows toward them. Since Jehovah God and Jesus Christ completely trust the faithful and discreet slave, should we not do the same? So, whom do you trust? You fully trust in Jehovah, Jesus, and the faithful slave. To a reasonable degree, you also trust all your fellow brothers and sisters.
And do you see yourselves as Jehovah God's spokespeople on earth?
That, I think, would seem to be quite presumptuous to say that we are the only spokesperson that God is using.
But acting like we know something when we don't is actually dishonest and probably motivated by pride.
Why do abusive and neglectful parents treat their children this way? Because that's how they were treated as children by their parents. And so the cycle of narcissistic abuse and childhood trauma continues to the next generation and the next, until eventually it reached ours. By now you're probably thinking, but Charlie, that was not my experience growing up. I was not treated like that. My parents loved and provided for me. They saw me and encouraged me to learn and explore my interests, up to a point. My parents were not psychopathic narcissists, and neither am I. To which I say, I believe you, and I agree. We've now established two ends of the childhood trauma spectrum, so where do ours fit between them? I'm going to propose that most Jehovah's Witness parents experienced abuse and neglect during childhood that was never fully resolved or even acknowledged. This left them vulnerable to mental and emotional manipulation.
When it comes to television programs that are designated for a mature audience, remember to tell yourself, I'm not old enough. I'm a young child. Remain humble and teachable like a child.
If that weren't true, they wouldn't have become Jehovah's Witnesses in the first place. And if they hadn't become Jehovah's Witnesses, those same vulnerabilities would have likely led them to join some other high-control group, religion, or community. That's the reason all of this will sound very familiar to any ex-Mormons who are watching. Hey guys, but I know that I was loved. I know it. My physical needs were provided for. I did have opportunities to learn and grow and get to know myself. I was seen, at least for a while, and there is a very real me at my core. So what gives? Well, I think that what happens is this. A Jehovah's Witness child is raised in a relatively typical environment. By typical, I don't mean good enough. I mean not extremely or overtly abusive. Most people on earth fall into that category, not just Jehovah's Witness kids. It's not until about 5 or 6 years old when we begin to encounter the outside world more fully. Most of us begin going to school around then, and that's when it starts to matter that we be not simply children, but Jehovah's Witness children, and that there's a price to pay for that.
Well, parents, of course, have a big responsibility to prepare their young ones. We study with them since they are very young, and once we have studied with them for 5, 6, 7 years, you would expect some progress from our young ones. If you studied with a Bible student for 5, 6, 7 years, you'd expect the student to make progress, wouldn't you?
5 or 6 years old is also when we begin asking very astute and reasonable questions about dinosaurs, Cain's wife, or Noah's flood. And we learn very quickly that there are some questions that you're only allowed to ask once, and the answers we receive are not open for discussion. This doesn't need to be overt. Children are incredibly perceptive, and when we do something that upsets our parents, we know it, even if they don't say anything. They don't need to.
In some countries, we find that young ones, 10, 11, 12 years old, are not even unbaptized publishers yet. And then we find that young ones 13, 14, 15 years old are not even baptized. And yet their parents have studied with them since infancy. Well, it makes us wonder sometimes, is our teaching program really effective?
5 or 6 years old is also when we begin to become aware that our parents are not the highest authority of our lives, that the elders in the watchtower are.
Now sometimes young ones feel that, they don't want to follow the truth too much. They don't feel like getting up and going out in field service on Saturday mornings, or maybe not to attend the meetings.
We unconsciously recognize that keeping ourselves out of trouble also keeps our parents out of trouble, And by performing in certain ways, behaving at the meetings, commenting, giving talks, preaching, these and only these things will bring us approval by our immediate family and the extended family of the congregation.
And the parents say, well, you know, I don't like to force my children to do something they don't want to do. I want it to come from their heart. But is that really wise?
At the same time, we learn that the reality of our experience, our actual thoughts, actual feelings, and actual needs and wants must be hidden, because there's a price to pay for honesty as well. We can't be honest, for instance, about how truly frightening it is to have to carry around a blood card to daily remind us that if we ever get into an accident or develop a severe illness, our parents will let us die even when it might be avoided. They will let us die because that's what Jehovah God, supreme ruler of the universe, has declared through an American publishing company based in New York.
And doctors come in, and here's what they say: Josh, you need a blood transfusion. Without it, you will die. We want to help you. You know what Josh responded? All alone. Then please respect my wishes about blood. He said, I told one doctor who tried to get me to take blood, you may think I'm crazy, but I have all my thinking abilities. I just want to live by Jehovah's law on blood. He knows what is best for us. The best thing for me is to respect the sanctity of life, and if I die, I will live again. Good example of faith in the face of incredible stress and persecution. Amazing young fella. And when he's resurrected, see, you'll hear more from him because Jehovah loves that little fella.
I like chapter 35 called We Can Wake Up from Death because I used to be afraid, and now I know that Jesus will resurrect us no matter what, and so I'm not afraid anymore.
So what do? We hide our fear and our thoughts and our feelings. We build a wall right down the middle of us between who we actually are and who we're being told we must be to deserve love and belonging.
Now, when parents say that they don't ever want their children to do anything they don't want to do, they really don't mean it.
Some parts we even hide from ourselves. And just as with the earlier example, not being seen and having to perform constantly is incredibly painful and traumatic, because by this point, there is a real person, a real self having these experiences. At some level, we sense this treatment is wrong, but since the people who are supposed to protect and provide for us are okay with it, we just go along. I mean, what other option is there?
You'd say, come on, get up. You're going to learn that there are things we have to do in life whether we feel like it or not. And you would commend yourself. You'd say, this is being a good parent.
We are dependent, and will remain so at least for the rest of our childhoods, painful though it is. So we pretend and we perform accordingly. We can't fight, we can't flee, so our only remaining options are to freeze and fawn. We'll talk more about that in the next video. Any emotional codependence already in place in the family is now being amplified and codified by the Watchtower.
Look well to the training of your children. And really, the progress that your children make, to a certain extent, shows what kind of a teacher you are.
Our hearts, minds, and bodies, and reality itself are sending constant messages that this doesn't make sense, or this doesn't feel right. But since paying attention to them might result in losing the love and belonging of our families and community, we begin to ignore our minds, bodies, and hearts to survive. And yet there's still a real person there, peeking through the mask that our parents have glued over our faces, desperately trying to make sense of all this. As with the previous example, this creates a situation in which our minds, hearts, and bodies are trying to serve two masters, our own reality and the fantasy being forced upon us without our consent. I think that the conflict between reality and fantasy becomes more obvious and difficult to maintain during adolescence, as a result of having greater autonomy, maturity, and access to information. But our double lives don't begin when we have a worldly girlfriend for a month in 7th grade, or go to a worldly party, or experiment with drugs or alcohol. No. Our double lives begin the moment we discover that we are not lovable or acceptable as we actually are, but only when we are performing a role that's been assigned to us. And when the only way to be good is to hide our actual thoughts, feelings, and needs, then those things all come to be seen as bad and shameful and selfish. I don't know about you, but I never expected to survive Armageddon as a child or teenager. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I knew deep down that nothing I did would ever be enough. I suspect that's true for a lot of us.
So you just take a look, and this is the idea Jehovah is getting across, at your hands. And you look at your hands now, only God, as he looks at your hands in here and all those that are tied in, does he see blood there? The humans sitting next to you, they might have an idea because they know you well and you haven't been out in service in weeks. Well, guess what? Most likely God's seeing some blood all over your hands. Or they go totally inactive, and we appeal to them, we try to help, but you cannot water down what God says here. If your hands are not clean because you've been out warning, then they have blood on them, and you're going to lose your life. That's what it is. It's a reality. And this is encouraging.
Does being raised as one of Jehovah's Witnesses provide children with a safe, secure base and sense of belonging? No. It offers an uncertain, unsafe, and highly conditional base, as demonstrated by the sadistic shunning of parents, siblings, or friends who leave or are disfellowshipped.
Disfellowship literally means no further spiritual fellowship with the individual. And as I point out, sorry, Chief Justice, as I point out at paragraph 22 of my factum, the nature of the relationship then of a disfellowship person is not completely shunned. The disfellowship person is able to come into the congregation, to the congregation meetings. They're able to attend in the Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses. They're able to sit wherever they like. They can sing the spiritual songs with the congregation. As far as their family members are concerned, normal family relations continue with the exception of spiritual fellowship.
Does being raised as one of Jehovah's Witnesses provide children with healthy and consistent nourishment in the form of love, attention, and learning? No. It offers conditional love, praise only when performing a role, nightmarish fantasies, and indoctrination instead of education. Does being raised as one of Jehovah's Witnesses provide children with healthy and consistent structure in the form of physical, mental, and emotional boundaries and protection? No. It offers physical insecurity and exposure to pedophiles and domestic abusers, mental cruelty and gaslighting, unhealthy constricting structure, and a complete absence of emotional boundaries.
Another way we can contribute to the oneness, rejecting false stories that are designed to separate us from Jehovah's organization. As an example, think about the apostate-driven lies and dishonesties that Jehovah's organization is permissive toward pedophiles. I mean, that is ridiculous, isn't it? If anybody takes action against someone who would threaten our young ones and takes action to protect our young ones, it's Jehovah's organization. We reject outright such lies.
And again, they are all elders, so they will all be men.
Yes.
And as I understand it, they would be considered to be spiritually qualified, mature brothers. I believe that's the terminology you use.
Correct.
So, and you say that they all go on a 5-month course. Does any of that course involve looking at allegations of child sexual abuse or issues around child protection?
Well, what it does deal with is how to be a good shepherd. And that is the bulk of our work in connection with dealing with child protection issues. How to be a shepherd, or how to provide pastoral care, you might express it.
And so would the people in the service department or the legal department that might receive telephone calls, would any of them received any specific training in child protection?
When you say specific training, yes, they're given specific training as far as our policies and familiarising themselves with our policies, and how to deal with telephone calls that come in from either distressed victims or from elders who choose to call in.
Do you have maybe somebody who's either a Jehovah's Witness or comes externally from, for example, the National Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Children, or from the local authority, or from other organisations who specialise in child protection to come to provide you with any advice or assistance? Or is it all something which is managed internally?
Yeah, that's correct. It's managed internally because the training is for what we do as a religious organisation. So it's very much a religious application of Bible principles. So that's why we don't have outside training. For example, how to assist victims of child abuse. So that's very much focused on the use of the scriptures to be able to do it.
So you don't have some other religious organisations that we've had evidence from. They will have a sort of child protection department that will often be staffed by people who may share the same religious beliefs, but who will have outside expertise in social work, usually social work, the probation service, education sometimes the law. You don't have that kind of department or that kind of arrangement.
Not in that organised way, no. Simply because we don't feel it relates to what we do as a religion.
You parents, do your best to package the gift of your children so that they will be useful to Jehovah.
Can you summarise from your perspective what the elders do in respect of every congregation? What's their job?
So their assignment involves taking the lead in teaching, taking the lead in shepherding those who need individual encouragement. They take the lead in our key activity, which is what we're well known for, evangelizing work. So the elders take the lead in, those are the three principal areas. So basically, before someone's appointed as an elder, they have to show that they love the Bible. They have to show that they have a good understanding of the Bible, and they've got the ability to teach well as far as our teachings are concerned.
And again, those elders wouldn't have any specific training in dealing with allegations of child sexual abuse. They might have spiritual training in terms of scriptural advice, support and assistance, but there wouldn't be any sort of practical training necessarily. Am I correct in thinking that?
Well, the practical training is basically reviewing the material, reviewing our policies on child abuse. Such as has been mentioned, they get the shepherding or the flock handbook that's given to elders. They would go through that, which is giving them specific instructions about how to handle such matters. So we do train our elders according to our guidelines and our ways of handling allegations of child abuse.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, Your Honor, Justice Jimenez.
So, Ms. Porter, respectfully, the allegation here is the mental and emotional equivalent of waterboarding. Surely you have to agree that if the allegations in the complaint are true, the conduct was reprehensible.
Well, my problem may be that I've heard the tape and I know that it's not true. I understand the allegation.
You've heard a tape. You've heard a tape, which in the First Amended complaint, the plaintiff strongly dispute is the tape. You heard a 6-minute tape versus a multi-hour tape that they allege goes into multiple instances of rape. But I'm saying assume the truth, right, of that allegation. Surely you would agree that's reprehensible conduct.
You mean for purposes of an IIED claim? I mean,
for purposes of general human decency.
I guess the reason I'm struggling with your question, and if I may, this proceeding was called for the specific purpose of determining whether she had sinned, whether she was repentant, and the status.
I think we've got lots of examples of your policies and practices. We'll talk a bit later about some of the individual policies you have in respect of child protection, but generally elders are meant to follow those practices and stick to them with quite strict adherence. Is that right? So things which are issued should be followed. They're not, you know, you can do this if you want, you don't have to.
Well, that's when it comes to organizational procedures.
Yeah.
If you're talking about helping people on a personal level, you know, we try to help individuals to reason on Bible principles. So it's not as if elders give instructions as to how a person should live their lives. If a person's looking for guidance in the congregation, we educate our elders to understand the principles that are involved and to share those principles with individuals so that they can make good decisions in their life.
It's yes or no. I mean, are you telling me that if the allegations in the complaint are true, you think that that's not reprehensible conduct?
Well, I guess I'm considering the fact that this kind of thing happens in court all the time. When you have two different people, remember the other participant denied that it was a physical rape and it actually provided at least some evidence. So they now had a dispute. This happens in court.
Defaulted, right?
Pardon?
So the other participant defaulted. So with respect to the other participant, the allegations are true.
Well, but that's not binding on us. I mean, when another defendant defaults.
I didn't say it's binding on you, but for purposes of that defendant in this litigation, he has admitted the rape.
Think about the apostate-driven lies and dishonesties that Jehovah's organization is permissive toward pedophiles.
And can I just double check? We've talked about there not being any sort of child protection department centrally or locally, because it sounds as if you don't have an elder who's in charge of child protection, for example.
We feel that any elder can be approached on child safeguarding matters. So any congregant can feel free to talk to an elder about their concerns.
And again, circuit overseers don't have any particular responsibility for child protection, is that right?
Well, as they visit congregations, they don't get involved with matters with individuals in the congregation because they're only there for a week. And usually with helping for a victim, well, that's a shepherding that may have to go on for some period of time. But they're well versed and well experienced in our principles to be able to give advice if the elders have questions about a matter.
What about the hypothetical that counsel used? What if they played a video of it and it depicted multiple instances of rape as alleged? That would be okay?
No, and I'm not saying whether these things are okay or not. I'm saying that these things happen in court all the time when you are trying to determine the truth. And here it is a core religious function.
I've been a judge for a long time and a lawyer for a long time. I've never seen in court anything like this that's alleged.
The audio?
So I take issue with that.
If anybody takes action against someone who would threaten our young ones and takes action to protect our young ones, it's Jehovah's organization.
How do we draw a line here? If this is an issue of degree, surely your position can't be anything goes within this room because it's a religious adjudication and they're trying to decide if she sinned and whether she can remain in the church. It can't be that anything goes. That's not your position, right?
It is not. It is not my position.
So where do you draw the line? If a religion believes in order to have someone repent, you have to torture that person. You have to do something that outside of the religion society would deem outrageous. Are they allowed to do that? Is that not even a viable claim?
Oh, I don't think torture no, you can't do torture. I mean, the reason I'm struggling is that I don't believe that it's this court's role to prospectively define lines of what it would be. But I'm happy to say torture would not pass that test. The sexual assault would not pass the test.
So if that's the case, then some allegation of something that happened in that room would be able to make out a claim that doesn't violate the Establishment Clause.
I believe that's probably true. I think physical might be a line, but this is hypothetical and not an issue in this case. But like that would be a line.
What would be the rationale that we would adopt? So we do need to find a line in terms of a rationale that we adopt for what could be a valid claim and what isn't. And here where you have, I don't think there's any disagreement that the allegations themselves constitute an IIED claim. I think the district court said that, look, if this were in a secular setting, this would make out that claim. So if you're agreeing that it can't be that anything goes in that room, there has to be some line. What do you have to allege to make out a successful IIED claim in your view that does not infringe upon the third prong of the Lemon test?
Well, I can give you examples of things, but I don't know that I can articulate a clear line because all I know is this does not reach that line.
But there won't be a sort of checklist. Sometimes in some other religious organisations we've seen they'll go in with a checklist and they will ask, have you done this? Have you done that? Are your policies up to date? Have you, various things from, the sublime to the ridiculous. You don't have any process like that.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do have a checklist that we give to circuit overseas.
Right, okay. And does that involve anything to do with examining or auditing child protection, or is it more about other matters?
They don't really audit child safeguarding matters, no.
But the thing I'm struggling with here is where to draw this line. I was serious when I asked the question of if the elders had called in the witness who had described in detail all of these things, that she was upset and distressed by that right in front of her parents, that could happen. Under this theory, can they do that? If there'd been a transcript, could they do that? The problem I have is that it's second guessing what everyone agrees these guys were trying to do, which was to make a fact finding. If we can analogize to the jury, it's fact finding and then the punishment.
Think about the apostate-driven lies and dishonesties that Jehovah's organization is permissive toward pedophiles. I mean, that is ridiculous, isn't it? If anybody takes action against someone who would threaten our young ones and takes action to protect our young ones, it's Jehovah's organization.
But if I understand your position, Ms. Porter, you say that there are some circumstances in which we would be permitted to second guess. Waterboarding, sexual assault, battery. And I know you're resisting helping us draw a line, but how do you draw a line between battery and the sort of outrageous conduct that is alleged here?
I mean, to me,
from a perspective of second guessing what's going on in that room, how do you articulate that?
And in my mind, I'm just drawing a line mentally in terms of a physical assault or attack or whatever. And I don't, I'm not even predicting what different types of things there can be. I'm just simply saying, this is not it.
And you, of course, that your organization, including people in positions of responsibility like elders, are not immune from the problem of child sexual abuse.
That appears to be the case.
The Royal Commission, the apology, and these yearly reports are about accountability, bringing the truth into the light. So I'm reporting that on 1 July this year, 6 institutions were named as having failed to declare their intention to join the scheme. Since then, 2 of these have joined. We still have, reprehensibly, 4 institutions who have been named publicly and who have blatantly refused to join the redress scheme. They are Jehovah's Witnesses, Kenja Communication, Lakes Entries Pony Club Incorporated, Fairbridge Restored Limited. It's not acceptable. We are currently finalising the further sanctions, I know, that are supported by the opposition, that the Commonwealth will place on institutions who continue to refuse to join the scheme, including withdrawal of their charitable status for these offending organisations.
This is the opposite of protection. This is how you create codependent doormats and victims, people who believe that their only value comes from serving their abusers and tolerating their abuse. So as I said at the beginning, being raised as one of Jehovah's Witnesses is, in itself, a form of child abuse. It is also a form of idolatry, because the reality of the child's existence and experience is sacrificed on the Watchtower's altar to the false image of the Jehovah's Witness child and the happy, healthy family that Jehovah's Witness parents desperately need to believe is real. It all comes back to authority. Our parents were never the highest authorities of our lives. The Watchtower was, and for many of us, it still is. Being raised a witness is like being raised in an orphanage by one's own parents. Like they're there, but they're not really in charge of anything, and we know they will not protect us. After rejecting their parental responsibility to provide for and protect their children, Jehovah's Witness parents become fellow dependents whose job it is to enable, enforce, and excuse the Watchtower's narcissistic abuse. Why do they do this? Because it reminds them of the narcissistic abuse they experienced during their childhoods. The Watchtower's abusive orphanage reminds them of home. I'm going to end this video by reading a short poem about parenting by the Lebanese poet Khalil Gibran from his masterpiece, The Prophet. It reads, "And a woman who held a babe against her bosom said, 'Speak to us of children.' And he said, 'Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you but not from you, and though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. You may give them your love but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you, for life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday. You are the bows from which your children as living arrows are sent forth. The archer sees the mark upon the path of the infinite, and he bends you with his might, that his arrows may go swift and far. Let your bending in the archer's hand be for gladness, for even as he loves the arrow that flies, so he loves also the bow that is stable." That, to me, is good enough parenting, and it sure would have been nice.
Do not become young children in your understanding.
And we thank all of you for your support. Thank you. Thank you very much. What about
As our dear brother Morris would say, cheer up, things are only going to get worse.